The invitation arrived by text message exactly 9 days before the ceremony. It wasn't an oversight. An oversight implies a lapse in memory, a momentary slip in a busy schedule where a name simply falls through the cracks, but this was deliberate. My stepmother, Alina, had crafted the message with the kind of calculated precision that only someone who views family as a chessboard could manage. She told me there simply wasn't room at the main table anymore. She said the venue in Cornwall, perched on those dramatic, windswept cliffs, had strict capacity limits due to local coastal preservation laws. She suggested, with a cold, superficial politeness, that it might be easier for everyone if I sat this one out. My half-sister, Chloe, was marrying into a prominent property development family, and the guest list had become a high-stakes corporate networking event. An active-duty military officer, especially one whose life didn't revolve around the London social calendar, apparently didn't fit the aesthetic. They thought my absence would be a quiet footnote, a minor detail easily swept under the rug while the champagne flowed and the cameras clicked. They didn't realize that while they were meticulously planning seating charts and obsessing over the arrangement of white roses, I was submitting a flight authorization request to the Ministry of Defense. They didn't know that the luxury coastal estate they had rented sat directly beneath the center line of a restricted airspace corridor. And they certainly didn't know that my squadron, the 809 Naval Air Squadron, was scheduled to conduct a low-level tactical training patrol over that exact stretch of the Atlantic coast at precisely 3 o'clock that Saturday afternoon. There is a specific kind of silence that settles in your chest when you realize you are entirely transactional to the people who raised you. For years, I was the reliable one. The daughter who took the commission, who flew the multi-million-pound airframes, who handled the grueling deployments without complaint, while Chloe was celebrated for simply existing. When you operate a high-performance machine at 40,000 feet, you learn to suppress immediate emotional responses. You compartmentalize. You take the pain, the rejection, the sudden realization that you are fundamentally invisible to your own blood, and you lock it away in a steel box inside your mind. You focus on the parameters. You look at the navigation data. You cross-check your instruments. But that text message broke something that had been brittle for a very long time. It wasn't just about a wedding. It was about a lifetime of being the background noise to Chloe's symphony. Alina had spent a decade subtly erasing my mother's memory from the house, and by excluding me from the family's biggest public milestone, she was attempting to complete the erasure. They expected me to stay in my quarters at RNAS Yeovilton, perhaps send a polite card with a modest check, and quietly accept my role as the distant, eccentric relative who was too busy with her career to touch the ground. They wanted the prestige of telling people their daughter was a fighter pilot, but they didn't want the actual person occupying the space. They wanted the title, not the presence. But the sky doesn't recognize social hierarchies. The North Atlantic doesn't care about property developers or high society weddings in Cornwall. When you're moving at 600 knots, the world below looks incredibly small, almost insignificant. The grand estates, the manicured lawns, the white marquees erected on the cliffs, they are just tiny geometric shapes on a digital moving map. For months, our squadron had been preparing for a joint maritime strike exercise, a complex series of low-level maneuvers designed to test our response times in coastal environments. The flight paths had been locked in for weeks, but the exact timing of the final run was subject to weather and air traffic control clearance. When the operational order came down the line on Thursday morning, the timing was immaculate. We were cleared for a low-altitude coastal sweep at 1,500 feet, directly over the rugged headlands of West Cornwall. The waypoint sequence put us directly over the estate at exactly 15 minutes past 3, right when the vows would be ending. Right when the guests would be gathering on the lawn for the official photographs. It wasn't a stunt. It wasn't a rogue deviation from duty. It was a perfectly synchronized, fully authorized military operation that just happened to intersect with the grandest day of Alina's life. They thought they had successfully pushed me into the shadows, out of sight and out of mind, so they could enjoy their perfect, undisturbed performance. They didn't understand that when you spend your life serving something larger than yourself, you don't disappear just because someone closes a door on you. Sometimes, the universe has a way of clearing the air with the force of 20,000 pounds of thrust, forcing everyone below to look up and realize exactly what they tried so hard to ignore. To understand how a family arrives at the point of excluding a daughter from a wedding, You have to understand the quiet, grinding machinery of favoritism that defined our household for 15 years. My father was a decent man, but he was a man who preferred peace over justice. When my mother passed away when I was 12, the house became a place of heavy, suffocating silence. A year later, Elena arrived, bringing with her Chloe, who was 2 years younger than me. Almost immediately, the architecture of our lives shifted. Elena was a woman driven by an intense, almost pathological need for social validation. She viewed life through the lens of appearances, status, and British upper-middle-class propriety. To her, everything was a performance and every family member was a prop. Chloe was cast as the fragile, artistic, brilliant prodigy who needed constant protection and endless praise. I, on the other hand, was cast as the stoic, self-sufficient observer. Because I didn't demand attention, because I didn't throw tantrums or require expensive private tutors to pass my exams, it was assumed I didn't need anything at all. I channeled that isolation into discipline. While Chloe was being driven to elite ballet classes that she would abandon 3 weeks later, I was running along the damp, muddy lanes of Somerset, building the lung capacity and physical stamina required for military service. I wanted something real. I wanted a world where success wasn't determined by a leaner's approval or a subjective compliment, but by objective parameters. In the air, there is no favoritism. The altimeter doesn't care who your parents are. The jet fuel burns the same way whether you are loved or neglected. When I earned my commission in the Royal Navy and was selected for fast jet training, my father looked proud for a fleeting moment, but Elena quickly shifted the conversation to Chloe's latest gallery exhibition, an exhibition funded entirely by my father's retirement account. Over the years, my visits home became shorter and more infrequent. Every time I stepped back into that house, I felt like a ghost walking through an estate that had already been divided among the living. My bedroom had been converted into Chloe's dressing area within 6 months of my departure for Dartmouth. My achievements, the grueling survival training, the carrier deck landings at night in heavy seas, the promotion to lieutenant, were treated as dangerous, slightly unladylike hobbies. They would mention my job to their neighbors when they wanted to sound progressive and interesting at dinner parties. But during actual family gatherings, I was expected to sit quietly, listen to Chloe's complaints about her interior design business, and pass the salt. The engagement to Julian, the son of a wealthy Berkshire developer, was the pinnacle of Elena's social ambition. For a year, the house was consumed by the wedding. The budget spiraled into 6 figures. Every detail, from the imported Italian linen to the specific shade of cream for the bridesmaid dresses, was treated with the gravity of an international diplomatic treaty. I offered to take leave to help with the preparations, to use my logistical experience from the Navy to coordinate transport or vendor management. Elena laughed it off, saying military logistics were a bit too heavy-handed for the delicate elegance they were aiming for. I watched from the periphery as the planning progressed, waiting for the formal invitation, waiting for my role in the day to be defined. I didn't expect to be a bridesmaid. Chloe had selected her friends from the London fashion scene for that, but I expected to be a sister. I expected to stand there in my dress uniform, representing my branch of the family, honoring my father. Then came the text message. It was sent at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, a time when Elena knew I would likely be asleep ahead of an early morning flight briefing. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive exclusion. She wrote that due to an unexpected administrative error by the venue coordinator, the seating capacity for the main reception room had been reduced. She explained that Julian's family had required an extra table for their business partners, and since I was so independent and understanding, she knew I wouldn't mind giving up my spot. She added that it would probably be quite boring for me anyway, given the corporate crowd, and that she knew how much I valued my rest between training cycles. The absolute lack of hesitation in her message was what cut the deepest. There was no phone call, no apology. No attempt to find a solution, to pull up a chair, to make room for the only other child in the immediate family. It was a clean, clinical excision. When I called my father the next day, his voice was heavy with a familiar, cowardly exhaustion. He told me Elena was under immense pressure, that Julian's family was contributing significantly to the honeymoon, and that he didn't want to cause a scene that would ruin Chloe's special day. He asked me to just let it go, promising we would have a nice family dinner together later in the autumn to celebrate properly. That was the moment the final thread snapped. The nice family dinner that would never happen, the endless deferral of my worth to preserve a leaner's peace. I realized then that my compliance wasn't virtue, it was enabling their cruelty. I thanked my father for his time, told him to have a wonderful day, and hung up the phone. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into the station commander's office. I walked out to the flight line, looked at the gray, sleek silhouette of the F-35B Lightning aircraft parked in the hangar, and realized that my real family wore flight suits and survival gear. My real family understood what loyalty, duty, and presence actually meant. The days leading up to the wedding were a study in absolute operational focus. In our line of work, personal distractions are a safety hazard. If your mind is drifting toward a family snub while you are performing a vertical landing on an aircraft carrier deck, you can lose control of a 90 million pound asset in a fraction of a second. I immersed myself completely in the planning for Exercise Joint Shield. It was a large-scale simulation involving multiple branches of the armed forces, designed to practice low-visibility coastal defense tactics along the southwestern peninsula. As the lead navigation officer for our four-ship formation, it was my responsibility to plot the precise waypoints for our low-level tactical transit. The route was highly complex, requiring us to drop down to 1,500 feet over the water, skim past the rugged cliffs of Devon and Cornwall, and utilize the terrain to mask our radar signatures from simulated adversary ground stations inland. On Wednesday afternoon, while sitting in the squadron planning room surrounded by large-scale digital charts and airspace notifications, I noticed the exact coordinates for our third major turn. The flight path took us directly over a designated headland near St. Ives, the very same headland where the luxury estate Aliner had rented for Chloe's wedding was situated. The airspace over that part of the coast is normally clear for low-level military operations, provided there are no active civilian aviation events or environmental restrictions. I checked the official notices to airmen, the NOTAMs, for that weekend. There were no flight restrictions listed for that specific coordinate. Aliner's wedding planners had spent tens of thousands of pounds on marquee hire, gourmet catering, and security guards to keep out the public, but they had completely forgotten to check the sky. They had treated the coastal estate as a private island, a sealed kingdom where they could control every variable, completely unaware that the air above them belonged to the crown. My commanding officer, Commander Harris, walked into the briefing room while I was staring at the chart. He was a veteran carrier pilot with a sharp eye and an absolute intolerance for administrative slack. He looked over my shoulder at the plotted route. He noticed the waypoint near the headland and looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew about my family situation. In a tight-knit squadron, you can't hide the fact that you aren't taking leave for your only sister's wedding. He didn't ask for details, but he had seen the subtle shift in my demeanor over the past week. He asked if there were any structural hazards or local complaints expected along that coastal stretch. I kept my voice entirely neutral, professional, and detached. I told him it was a standard low-level corridor, completely clear of civilian flight paths, but noted there was a private event scheduled at an estate on the cliff edge around 3 o'clock. I told him we could adjust the waypoint 3 miles out to sea if he preferred to minimize the acoustic footprint. Harris stared at the map for a long moment, then tapped the glass with his pen right on the center line of the original route. He said the operational parameters required us to simulate a tight terrain-following profile to maintain the realism of the radar evasion exercise. He said we would stick to the original flight path, exactly 1,500 feet, 600 knots, in a tight diamond formation. He looked at me and said that if anyone on the ground had a problem with the sound of freedom, they could file a complaint with the Ministry of Defense after the exercise was concluded. The psychological tension inside me began to build into something cold and solid. I wasn't seeking revenge in a chaotic, destructive way. I was simply allowing the reality of my world to cross paths with the illusion of theirs. Aliner and Chloe had spent years treating my career as a minor inconvenience, a distant background detail that didn't matter in their world of luxury and social positioning. They truly believed that by excluding me from the guest list, they had successfully removed me from the day. They had no conception of the scale of the world I lived in. To them, power was a prime seat at a reception or a mention in a society column. They didn't understand the kind of power that comes from directing thousands of pounds of thrust through a pair of Pratt and Whitney engines, controlled by a highly trained pilot who had been told she wasn't important enough to sit at their table. On Friday night, the evening before the wedding, I received a final text from my sister, Chloe. It wasn't an apology either. It was a photo of her and Alina standing in the middle of the beautifully decorated marquee, holding glasses of pink champagne, surrounded by floral arrangements that looked like clouds. The caption read, "Wish you could have made it, but we know how busy you are with your little planes." The sheer, condescending trivialization of my life's work was breathtaking. They didn't even have the honesty to admit they had uninvited me. They had rewritten the narrative in their own minds to make it look like I was the one who had failed to show up for them. I didn't reply. I locked my phone in my locker, walked out to the dark flight line, and watched the engineering crew performing the final pre-flight checks on the aircraft. The gray skin of the jets gleamed under the sodium lights. The technicians moved with quiet, practiced efficiency, checking hydraulic lines, testing flight control surfaces, ensuring every system was flawless. This was a world of absolute reality. If a bolt is loose, the plane fails. If a calculation is wrong, the mission is compromised. There is no room for vanity here. No room for rewriting the truth to make yourself feel better. I looked at the aircraft I would be flying the next day, and for the first time in weeks, the knot in my chest completely loosened. I knew exactly where I belonged, and I knew that the next afternoon, my family would finally understand it too. Saturday morning brought the kind of clear, high-visibility blue sky that pilots dream of. The air was crisp, the wind was steady from the west, and the visibility over the English Channel was near infinite. In the squadron locker room, the atmosphere was thick with the quiet intensity that precedes a major tactical run. We pulled on our anti-G suits, zipped up our flight jackets, and adjusted the harness straps with familiar, rhythmic movements. My wingman, Lieutenant Miller, walked over and checked his gear in the mirror next to mine. He gave me a brief, knowing nod. The entire flight crew knew the flight path, and they knew exactly what sat at the apex of our third waypoint. They didn't say a word about weddings or stepmothers. They didn't need to. In our world, solidarity isn't expressed through dramatic speeches. It's demonstrated by holding a tight formation, keeping your relative position within a matter of feet, and executing the mission precisely as planned. We walked out to the flight line at exactly 1 o'clock. The heat rising from the concrete blended with the sharp, distinct smell of aviation fuel. Climbing into the cockpit of an F-35B is a transformative experience. Once you're strapped into that seat, surrounded by the panoramic touchscreen displays and the complex array of tactical switches, the ground world ceases to exist. You become an extension of an incredibly powerful machine. I went through the automated startup sequence, watching the engine gauges climb steadily into the green, feeling the deep, low-frequency vibration of the engine settling into a steady, powerful idle behind me. Over the comms, Commander Harris's voice came through crystal clear, assigning our call signs and confirming our departure clearance from the tower. We taxied out in a single, elegant line, 4 massive gray shapes moving across the tarmac like predators heading for a hunt. The takeoff was flawless. We blasted down the runway in 20-second intervals, afterburners cooking the air behind us, before climbing rapidly into the clean blue sky above Somerset. We formed up immediately into a tight, aggressive diamond formation, our wings separated by mere meters, moving as a single, coordinated organism. As we leveled off at 20,000 feet to begin our transit toward the coast, I looked down at the rolling green landscape of the southwest below us. Up here, the petty dramas of human vanity are completely invisible. You can't see social status from 4 miles up. You can't see who has the best table or who is wearing the most expensive dress. You only see the raw, beautiful geography of the world. At exactly 2:45, we received the tactical clearance from Maritime Air Control to descend for our low-level coastal run. Commander Harris pushed his stick forward, and the entire formation tilted downward, diving toward the sparkling blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The speed pushed past 500 knots, the landscape rushing toward us with terrifying, beautiful velocity. We leveled out at 1,500 feet above the water, skimming just above the white crests of the waves, using the dark, jagged cliffs of the Cornish coast as our visual reference points. The sheer G-force of the tight turns pressed me back into my seat, a familiar, heavy reassurance that I was entirely alive, entirely in control. I checked the master navigation display. The second waypoint dropped behind us as we rounded the sweeping arc of St. Ives Bay. The time was exactly 3:13. According to the wedding schedule Alina had proudly posted online weeks ago, the ceremony would be wrapping up right about now. The guests would be stepping out of the chapel onto the main lawn overlooking the sea, champagne glasses in hand, gathering for the grand group photograph with the ocean as their perfect, elite background. I could see the headland coming up over the nose of my aircraft. The white marquee was clearly visible now, a tiny, pristine square of canvas pitched on the very edge of the emerald cliff, surrounded by tiny, colorful specks that were people dressed in their finest formal wear. Through the clear visor of my helmet, I locked my eyes on the target. We were moving at nearly 11 miles a minute. The acoustic signature of our approach was completely masked by our speed. At 550 knots and 1,500 feet, a fast jet arrives before its sound does. To the people standing on that lawn, the sky would look completely peaceful, silent, and undisturbed. They would be smiling for the photographer, raising their glasses, entirely convinced that they owned the afternoon. They had no idea that 4 multi-million-pound fighter jets were screaming toward them from the sea, packed so tightly together that their wings almost overlapped, carrying with them the full, undeniable weight of the reality they had tried so hard to shut out. The transition happened in less than 3 seconds. As our formation crossed the surf line and roared directly over the cliff edge, the sound caught up with us. 20,000 pounds of thrust from each of the 4 engines slammed into the headland like a physical blow. The acoustic pressure wave hit the ground with an earth-shaking, window-rattling boom that would have instantly drowned out the classical string quartet, shattered the delicate crystal glasses on the tables, and sent the floral arrangements tumbling into the grass. The sheer, overwhelming power of the military aircraft completely colonized the space, obliterating the carefully constructed illusion of elite exclusivity. I didn't look down through the glass canopy. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening on that lawn. I knew that Alina would be dropping her glass in sheer terror, her expensive silk dress splattered with champagne. I knew Julian's high society business partners would be ducking instinctively, their carefully coiffed hair ruined by the massive wake turbulence rolling off our wings. I knew Chloe would be screaming in frustration as the official wedding photograph, the centerpiece of her social media campaign, was permanently hijacked by the massive, unmistakable silhouettes of 4 Royal Navy fighter jets cutting a scar across the sky directly above her head. They wanted a dramatic coastal backdrop for their perfect day, and they got one. They got the absolute, thunderous reality of the daughter they had deemed too insignificant to fit at their table. We didn't linger. We maintained our strict operational profile, pulling up into a sharp, synchronized climb out of the corridor, banking hard to the left as we headed back out over the open ocean toward our base. The entire run over the estate had taken less than 5 seconds, but in those 5 seconds, the entire balance of power within our family had been permanently, irrevocably reset. They had spent 15 years trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me that my life, my discipline, and my service were just background noise to their shallow vanity. But you cannot ignore a fast jet at 1,500 feet. You cannot look down on someone who commands the sky above your head. When I landed back at Yeovilton an hour later and completed the post-flight debriefing, I walked back to the locker room and finally retrieved my phone. It was completely blowing up. There were 17 missed calls from Alina, 5 frantic texts from Chloe, and a single long message from my father. I opened Chloe's text first. It was a video recorded by one of the guests. The camera had been pointed at the bride and groom on the lawn when suddenly, the terrifying, magnificent roar of our engines completely overwhelmed the audio, turning the screen into a vibrating blur of motion as 4 gray jets tore through the sky directly overhead. The guests were scattered, the marquee canvas was flapping wildly in the rotor wash, and Alina could be heard in the background screaming about the ruined cake. My father's message was different. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, chastened, and profoundly stunned. He wrote that one of Julian's uncles, a retired senior officer in the Royal Air Force, had recognized the squadron markings on the lead aircraft. He had told the entire wedding party exactly what those planes were, who flew them, and exactly how much skill and authority it took to command a fast jet formation over a restricted coastal zone. My father wrote that the entire reception had spent the rest of the afternoon talking about me, asking questions about my service, completely ignoring the property developers and the floral arrangements. He said he finally realized what I actually did for a living, and how deeply he had failed me by letting Alina push me away. I sat on the wooden bench in the locker room, the smell of leather and flight gear around me, and felt a profound, beautiful sense of closure. I didn't text Chloe back. I didn't call a leaner to gloat, I didn't need to. The sky had spoken for me and its voice was absolute. They had tried to lock me out of their small, fragile world, completely unaware that I had already conquered a much larger one. I deleted the messages, turned off the notifications, and walked out of the hangar into the late afternoon sun, completely free of the past. Have you ever been intentionally left out by people who couldn't handle your success or respect your boundaries? How did you handle the situation, and did you ever get your moment of validation? Share your story in the comments below. Let's talk about finding our worth outside of systems that refuse to see us.